Yes, my name's Jessica. I'm a PhD student in I'm a PhD student in Steve Cook's lab at Carleton, and today I'm going to be talking about some of the research I've been doing for my PhD on permit in Florida and evaluating a newly established seasonal fishing closure. So the Florida Keys are made up of a variety of different habitat types, famously nearshore flats that are kind of grassy and sandy, and then these offshore structures along the Florida reef tract that include, I'm going to go back, natural reefs as well as artificial reefs and wrecks. And both of these things are used by different recreational users, so anglers as well as divers and boaters. One of the particularly important offshore natural reefs is Western Dry Rocks, which is a natural structure that's about 10 kilometers off of Key West, the southernmost point of the continental United States. And Western Dry Rocks is home to a variety of different fish species and supports a couple different species that aggregate there to spawn at different times of the year, including things like grouper and snapper, and my study species there, the permit. The problem is, of course, with these spawning aggregations, they gain a lot of attraction from recreational anglers because they're considerably easier to see when they've aggregated, and they make for a fun fishing day as well. So permit in Florida exists in two separate fisheries. So there's the offshore reefs, like I showed you there, but there's also a flats fishery that has lower amounts of fish than this. This is actually a photo. This is a photo of the spawning aggregation at Western Dry Rocks, so you can see just how many there are. But the reefs are known for being considerably lower effort for higher yield. So if you go out there on a charter, you're going to see many fish an hour and catch many an hour even, compared to the flats, which is considerably lower yield for higher effort. So it might be a good day if you even see one fish on the flats. Over time, guides and anglers in the area identified that they were concerned about the decline of the overall quality of fishing. So anglers on the flats identified that they felt like the quality of fishing was going from fair to poor. And similarly on the reefs, they were concerned that the fishing was going from good to fair. So the general consensus with that, there was some concerns overall across South Florida that the quality of permit angling had decreased. So to address this problem, because there was not a lot known about their spatial ecology and reproductive ecology, my co-advisor, Jake Brownscombe, tagged a ton of permit between 2016 and 2019 with support from the Bonefish and Tarpon Trust, and tracked permit all across South Florida to figure out what was going on across this fishery. And this work we're lucky to be supported by a bunch of different data management networks. So the array looks something like this, you'll see there. It's changed over time, but basically what this is showing you is that we had exceptional coverage across South Florida to figure out where these fish were going and what they were doing. Now, the big takeaway from this work, and this is just a connectivity kind of movement plot. So the bigger the dots, the more detections, the thicker the lines, the more movement between the corridors. And what Jake found was that there's a lot of fish moving back and forth between the flats and the offshore reefs and wrecks. So the same fish that are being targeted on the flats in that fishery are the same fish that are seen offshore spawning at the aggregations. And one of those sites that was particularly important was this one down here, which was, of course, Western Dry Rocks. And again, this is just a clip of the spawning aggregation at Western during their peak spawning, which is between April and July. But you can see that there's tons of fish there. They're considerably easier to see and catch if you go out there on a boat, and thus it makes them susceptible to angling pressure and overexploitation. And so this information helped to originally adjust their harvest period. So originally you couldn't harvest permit, and there were some bag limits and length limits from May to July. But with this information, they identified that April was also an important spawning month for permit, so they were getting to Western a little bit sooner. And with that, they helped push the harvest prohibition period to April. However, more research also identified that permit are incredibly susceptible to depredation, and at Western Dry Rocks specifically, depredation rates can be as high as 90%, which makes catch and release for them during the reproductive period pretty unsustainable. In response to this information and some information on other species in the area, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission established the Western Dry Rocks seasonal fishing closure, which is now an annual closure from April 1st to July 31st of each year. And with this, there's also a 7-year sunset provision to make sure that the protected area is working as expected and that it is serving permit and the other species that aggregate there and keeping them safe when they're spawning. The issue is our traditional metrics for long-term, for seasonal fishing closures and marine protected areas is that they are more long-term population responses. So we think of things like biomass, changes in abundance, changes in length, and those can take several generations to manifest. And so to address this in a more management-friendly timeline to comply with that 7-year sunset provision, we are using some shorter-term behavioral responses, including things like residency time, regional connectivity, and space use as a proxy for these longer-term responses. And so to do this, we went out and tagged a bunch more permit across the Keys. And we focused our efforts at Western Dry Rocks, but also used a couple non-protected other aggregation sites that are susceptible to angling. So these sites up here in the middle Florida Keys, this is Thunderbolt, it's a shipwreck, and this is 7 Mile Bridge rubble. It's a cluster of rubble that they've dropped offshore that's also an artificial reef now. And we've also focused some of our analytical efforts on Eyeglass Bar here, which is a little bit close to Western and is a natural reef site as well. So this has given us just basically a good picture of our treatment and our controls, and we've also generated before and after data since the seasonal fishing closure was established. And through this, we've created a pretty expansive data set of detections and permit, and have had this going on with the split from 2021, which we consider the post-seasonal fishing closure era, and then everything before that is from the pre-seasonal fishing closure. So this is our estimates of residency time. So we did this as probability of detection. So each fish that was at one of these particular sites got a 1. If they were detected elsewhere or not at all, they got a 0. And this helped us to figure out if permit were more likely to be detected at any of these sites before or after the closure. Our results showed us that 3 of these sites we saw statistical differences in their probability of residency since it was established. So at Western Dry Rocks and 7 Mile Bridge rubble, the artificial reef, they are more likely to be detected now. And at Eyeglass Bar, they're actually less likely to be detected. Now, focusing on Western, this is a positive sign. If the fish are spending more time there and more likely to be detected there, that's a positive outcome for the seasonal fishing closure. And also, because Eyeglass Bar is close by, if they're spending more time at Western compared to Eyeglass, it might mean that there's some shift from fish aggregating there and moving to the more protected nearby Western Dry Rocks. Similarly, we did the same calculation, but across months. And what we see here basically is just similar trends to what we know about their spawning aggregation behavior. So they're getting there in April and staying kind of through the spawning season. The one thing that we are interested in is that there seems to be an uptick of probability of detection in March. So originally the spawning season was May until July. We're looking at this now that perhaps March is also an important month in their overall spawning period and reproductive season. Taking a look at regional connectivity, so this is the same graph I showed earlier. Again, the size of the node just means more detections. The size of the lines is the corridors of movement. And there's been a change in receiver coverage over the years, so there's not that there's less connectivity. What we're seeing is similar connectivity. Fish are moving offshore and back to the flats like we would expect, and that's positive. But we did notice that some of the fish that we tagged in the lower Keys stay more in the lower Keys compared to the fish tagged up in the middle Keys, they stay in the middle Keys. So there's only a smaller subset of mixing fish. And I think only 1 fish across all of our data from 2016 to 2025 have ever been to all 4 sites. So we're seeing some regional disconnect in these 2 groups, meaning that if Western Dry Rocks is meant to protect all of the fish across South Florida and the Florida Keys, it's likely not sufficient for the fish that are not coming down there where they are still spawning and experiencing pressure from anglers. Finally, looking at space use at Western Dry Rocks specifically, this is kind of an idea, it's kind of hard to see in this lighting. There's been a lot of change over the years in our array, but what you'll see is that the core center of the receivers has always been outlined around the actual boundaries. So it's given us a really good idea of how things have changed over time. And so to do this, we took utilization distribution metrics, we calculated centers of activity, and created these kernel density estimates. So the purple, and you see in the middle, is the core space use, and the yellow is the more expanded home range. And what we've noticed here is that since the seasonal fish enclosure was established, the core purple area is actually retracting. So it's a little bit smaller than it was prior to the establishment of the seasonal fish enclosure. And the overlap of that core use during their spawning season is actually 90% within the boundary, which is excellent. The one thing that we are keeping an eye on and looking into to try and figure out is this kind of northern edge. There seems to be some fish that are spending time outside of the boundary, which is maybe a little concerning. But given that it's 90% overlap, right now it's showing pretty excellent success for that. The other thing we've looked at is just year-round presence at Western. We see here that, again, they're retracting their kind of space use in the spawning months. So when they're spawning, they're tightly balled versus the rest of the year, they're kind of expanding that range. And we do see year-round presence of permit at Western, so they're there all season. January and December are not on this plot just because there's not enough detections to create comprehensive spatial analysis. But permit are at Western year-round, which is interesting as well. Finally, something we're working on right now, and I'm going to be brief with this. If anyone saw Andy's talk about the giant trevally in the Seychelles, some math is complicated. But basically what this tells us is we're trying to figure out when they're not detected within the array, are they outside of it, and where are they going, and how often are the movements that are happening within the space versus outside of the space. And so because permit are super mobile, we expected the kind of natural break in the algorithm that splits up within range and restricted movements to be much bigger than this, because there's we just expected that they might be shuttling around to other locations or going back to the flats to feed. But what we found is that most of the permit that are there are spending time within the array when they're there. And when you look at this on a monthly trend, what was extremely interesting to us was that this period is actually when we see the most out of range movements. So during the spawning season, they're actually getting lost out of the array more often than these other shoulder seasons. So the fish that are there when they're when it's wintertime and they're not spawning potentially, they're hunkered down and they're more resident to the site and within the array compared to the seasonal closure where they might be roving around outside a little bit, or they might just be getting lost because of the movement of the aggregation around the boundary. And so our takeaways, we're seeing higher residency at Western, seasonal patterns that are consistent with spawning, which is excellent. Connectivity exists, although it is low between our reference sites, so that might be something to consider for the future. And 90% of the range does fall within the seasonal fish enclosure. However, there is still opportunity for further spatial refinement if that boundary wanted to be expanded, or because of the expansive array, if other fish were to be tagged and analyzed for similar metrics, we might be able to create something that's a little more refined to account for more fish overall. But the current boundary is working, and we're hoping for continued monitoring for longer-term effects to help bolster this assessment. So again, those traditional metrics like biomass, abundance, and length. Again, there is room for refinement, so it could be expanded on the boundary. We might consider a temporal refinement again, looking at March or even August, just to be more comprehensive of the spawning period in its entirety. And if there are concerns identified for the more northern spawning sites, it may be worth considering additional measures of other seasonal fish enclosures or restrictions for angling. And with that, I want to thank everyone that makes this project possible in the field and online, and I'm happy to take any questions if I have any time. Yes, hi Ross.
I love the new spatial analysis.
Yes, thank you.
So, yeah, I guess, I don't know, I don't have a question.
Thank you. Julie.
So this concern about the permit
Yeah.
populations was brought by the guide.
Yes.
By the user.
Yes.
So after these things have been established, are they 100% behind it? Are the anglers behind these protected areas?
Yes. Many are. BTT and some of the other groups like the Lower Keys Guide Association have done a really good job of identifying and explaining these things, but because they're the ones that brought forth the concern, my experience, at least with it and talking to people and sharing this data, is that they are happy with kind of the management decision. Again, recognizing that when you close a fishery or close a space that people use for economic gain and also personal recreation, there are concerns with it. But overall, there is kind of a positive sentiment towards it. And I do think that given that they've got the timeline to evaluate and redefine as and if needed, I think that helps kind of keep a little bit more peace on the situation.